Resisting Wars in Central America, Part 3 by Sanderson Beck. Costa Rica and Arias. Let us then combat war with peace. Let us combat totalitarianism with the power of democracy. United in ideals and principles, joined by dialogue and democracy, we can and will bring hostilities to an end. We must give peace a chance. Oscar Arias to the U.S. Congress, September 22, 1987. Peace is a process which never ends. It is the result of innumerable decisions made by many persons in many lands. It is an attitude, a way of life, a way of solving problems and of resolving conflicts. It cannot be forced on the smallest nation, nor can it be imposed by the largest. It can neither ignore our differences nor overlook our common interests. It requires us to work and live together. Oscar Arias, The Art of Peace, 115. Costa Rica has a long history of liberalism in education. General Tomas Guardia did take over the country in 1870 and ruled it as president for 12 years. But in 1877, he promulgated a liberal law of individual rights that protected freedom of religion, speech, and the press. Public education was greatly expanded when he made primary education free and obligatory for both sexes. In 1889, President Bernard Soto allowed an honest election and was persuaded by demonstrators to let the opposition party take office after they won. Rafael Angel Calderón came to power as a representative of the upper class in 1940, but he formed an alliance with Catholics and Communists to form the United Social Christian Party. In his 4 years, he brought about major social and economic reforms, letting cultivators claim unused land, making taxes progressive, establishing a minimum wage, providing unemployment compensation, and codifying workers' rights. However, World War II caused economic hardship and inflation. In 1948, a disputed election erupted into civil war and brought José Figueres, known as Costa Rica's national hero, Don Pepe, to power. He ruled as the president of the founding junta of the Second Republic for 18 months, disbanding the army and nationalizing the banks and insurance companies. The 1949 Constitution promoted even more public education and made it compulsory to age 14. He was opposed by Nicaragua's Somoza, who became his bitter enemy. Figueres founded the National Liberation Party and was twice elected president, governing Costa Rica 1953 to 57 and 1970 to 74. The welfare state of Costa Rica reached a crisis in 1980 when its debt became the largest per person in the world. Sandinistas had used Costa Rica as a base for attacking the Somoza regime, and in 1979, about 50,000 Nicaraguans took refuge in Costa Rica. Also, tens of thousands of Salvadorans fled the civil war in their country by settling in Costa Rica. In the early 1980s, Contras led by disgruntled Sandinista Eden Pastora operated from there. The Reagan administration's proxy war against the Sandinistas also secretly sent $9.6 million in military aid to Costa Rica, giving their civil and rural guard 4,000 M16 rifles, 200 M79 grenade launchers, and 120 M60 machine guns. Reagan propaganda was gladly accepted by Costa Rica's 3 daily newspapers, and U.S. military advisors arrived in 1985. Roads in northern Costa Rica were paved, and helicopters and 4 small planes were purchased for the Civil Guard. Soldier of Fortune magazine recruited mercenaries to join the Contras. Former Sandinista Commander Zero, Eden Pastora, led the Democratic Revolutionary Alliance, ARDE, in Costa Rica, but he refused to be dominated by the Somocista Contras in the Northern Nicaraguan Democratic Force, FDN, operating from Honduras, and he resisted CIA pressures to unite with them. On May 30th, 1984, Pastora held a press conference at La Panca in which a powerful bomb killed 3 journalists and 5 Contras, wounding 26 others, including journalist Tony Aberjan. Costa Rican security officers and U.S. officials immediately blamed the Sandinistas for trying to assassinate Pastora, who eventually withdrew completely from the Contra effort in May 1986. However, an investigation by Aberjan and Martha Honey indicated that this was a cover-up for a CIA operation that was connected to John Hull, who owned a ranch in Costa Rica. They got information from a Carlos who explained that Hull's ranch was used for trafficking in arms, cocaine, and marijuana. Aberjan and Honey published their findings and were sued for libel by John Hull, but they won the case in a Costa Rica court. The most remarkable thing about Costa Rica is that it survived amid these Central American wars with little or no army, relying since 1947 on the Rio Mutual Defense Treaty. On February 2, 1986, Oscar Arias was the first peace candidate to be elected president of Costa Rica, and on the day of his inauguration, he quietly ordered U.S. Ambassador Louis Tams to shut down the Santa Elena airstrip that had been used to supply the Contras in Costa Rica. Arias fired its administrator, Colonel Jose Montero, and ordered Security Minister Hernán Guerrón to have a civil guard patrol the airstrip to prevent its being used. However, in June, his orders were secretly countermanded as Guerrón and Vice Minister Rogelio Castro removed the guards and only ordered occasional patrols. In July, the government of Nicaragua sued Honduras and Costa Rica in the World Court. Unlike the U.S. and Honduras, the government of Costa Rica accepted the jurisdiction of the World Court. Tams persuaded Arias not to publicize his stationing of the guards on the Santa Elena base on September 8th, the day they impounded 77 drums of aviation fuel and put them on the runway to prevent use of the airstrip. Speaking to the United Nations General Assembly on September 24th, President Arias expressed his concern about Nicaragua's totalitarian regime of Marxist ideology. But the next day, Minister Guerrón announced that the covert airstrip used by the Contras had been closed. In October 1986, CIA Director Casey flew to San Jose, but Arias refused to meet with him in secret. When Arias went to Washington to meet with President Reagan in December, he made sure many people were present when he met with Casey. Arias urged peaceful solutions, especially in Nicaragua, and was promised that $40 million in frozen USAID would be released for Costa Rica. At San Jose, in February 1987, he presented his peace proposal to the presidents of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, calling for ceasefires, suspending outside military aid to guerrillas, amnesty for political prisoners, free elections, and negotiations between governments and unarmed opposition forces. The next month, the U.S. Senate voted 97-1 to support the Arias plan. In July, Arias announced that the Santa Elena property would become part of the Santa Rosa National Park to protect the largest dry tropical forest in Central America. In August 1987, at Esquipulas in Guatemala, all 5 Central American presidents signed the peace accord that called for verification by the United Nations and the Organization of American States. They agreed to implement by November ceasefires, democratization, stopping aid to the Contras and other insurgents, and removal of the Contra bases from Honduras and Costa Rica. They plan to meet in January to certify this implementation. President Reagan denounced this Central American plan as fatally flawed. The USAID funds for Costa Rica had been stopped since the peace process began in February 1987. But by threatening a scandal, Democrats led by Senator John Kerry got the aid resumed. The government of Nicaragua withdrew its suit against Costa Rica and lifted its press restrictions. On September 22nd, Arias addressed the U.S. Congress, informing them that he would not let the U.S. dehumanize the Costa Rican economy because of foreign creditors' demands, and saying, the new economic organization must be based on equity and security. No economy based on greed and intimidation can ever be established in Costa Rica in the name of efficiency. Arias announced that school children would compete to design a new uniform to replace the camouflage fatigues donated by the U.S. He commended the United States on the bicentennial of its Constitution, and he quoted John Kennedy's words during his visit to Costa Rica in 1963. Today, the principles of non-intervention and the peaceful resolution of disputes have been so firmly embedded in our tradition that the heroic democracy in which we meet today can pursue its national goals without an armed force to guard its frontiers. Arias concluded his speech by suggesting that they could overcome war and totalitarianism with peace and the power of democracy. In October 1987, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. When the 5 Central American presidents met again at San Jose on January 15, 1988, they found that most of the agreements had been implemented, except that Honduras had not closed down the Contra camps in its territory. Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega announced not only the end of its 6-year-old state of emergency, but also ceasefire talks with the Contras, freeing the remaining 3,200 political prisoners, and the scheduling of municipal elections. In an article in the New York Times, Ortega wrote that Nicaragua was ready to negotiate limiting armed forces, removing foreign military advisors, and banning foreign military bases. Arias also announced in January that all Contra leaders living in Costa Rica must renounce the armed struggle or leave. On March 23, OAS Secretary General Jolo Baina Soares presided at SAPOA meeting on the Costa Rican border for the signing of the ceasefire agreement between Nicaragua and the Contras. In 1988, Arias complained that the United States was secretly funding private sector organizations in order to subvert Costa Rica's government institutions. The central bank had to pay a market interest on loans that was currently 21%. Economic support funds, ESF, paid for by U.S. and Costa Rican taxpayers, were being used to finance private companies that threatened government agencies. Arias solved this problem by withdrawing from the Agency for International Development, USAID, programs. Without even having an army or navy, Costa Rica had survived the war years relatively unscathed and had led the region to a peaceful solution despite the hostile interference from the United States in its fear of communism. In the spring of 1984, Christic Institute attorney Daniel Sheehan became concerned about plans by the Reagan administration to lock up 400,000 Central American immigrants as part of a state of domestic national emergency if U.S. troops invaded Central America. Tony Averjan and Martha Honey asked Daniel Sheehan to bring a lawsuit under the Racketeering Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, and he publicized the elaborate story of how a secret team of ex-military and CIA operatives illegally arranged for the Contras to receive weapons, smuggle cocaine, and plotted to murder Pastora at the La Penca news conference. Sheehan carefully avoided including any current government employees so that the resources of the U.S. Justice Department would not be used against him. The suit charged 29 people with criminal misconduct, including John Hull, Tom Posey, Robert Owen, Theodore Shackley, Thomas Kleins, Richard Secord, Edwin Wilson, Albert Hakim, Rafael Quintero, Adolfo Calero, and John Singlaub. In June 1988, Judge James Lawrence King dismissed the suit before it even went to trial for lack of evidence on the alleged bomber Amak Galil. Yet King had not allowed them to present that evidence. Then Judge King ordered Daniel Sheehan and plaintiffs Tony Averchin and Martha Honey to pay $1 million for frivolous litigation. When they appealed to the 11th Circuit Court, a liberal judge on that court, Robert S. Vance, was murdered by a pipe bomb in the mail. Another bomb was found in the 11th Circuit clerk's office and was defused. But a third bomb killed a civil rights attorney. 11th Circuit Judge J.L. Edmondson was being protected by U.S. Marshals because Vance's murder was unsolved, and a shot shattered a window in his limousine. The 11th Circuit denied the appeal, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the case. In 1996, reporter Gary Webb retold the whole story in his three-part series, Dark Alliance, in the San Jose Mercury News, emphasizing how this criminal conspiracy that was intent on supplying wars had also greatly contributed to the crack epidemic of the 1980s by importing so much cocaine. During the 1987 Iran-Contra hearings in Congress, a man had been arrested for unfurling a banner saying, "Ask about cocaine." For this effort to raise public awareness, he was imprisoned for more than a year. Yet most of the criminals in the Iran-Contra conspiracy that subverted American foreign policy never spent any time in prison, because they were pardoned by President Bush, or, as in the case of North and Poindexter, had their cases overturned because Congress had given them immunity. Bush's Panama invasion. U.S. troops intervened in Panama 3 times between 1865 and 1873. The U.S. Congress in 1902 authorized buying a strip of land in Panama from Colombia for a canal. In the next year, U.S. gunboats helped secessionists break away from Colombia. The United States then signed a treaty with these Panamanians and used troops while they built the canal that opened in 1914. President Theodore Roosevelt in 1904 proclaimed his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, that the United States would be an international police force in Central America. U.S. troops intervened in Panama in 1918 during elections, in 1921 because of a border conflict with Costa Rica, and in 1925 because of a rent strike in Panama City. From 1930 to 1945, the government of Panama prohibited labor organizing. During World War II, the U.S. built many more military bases in Panama. In 1953, the U.S. established the Panamanian National Guard that was based on Anastasio Somoza's Nicaraguan National Guard. A controversy over whether Panamanian flags could be flown in the Canal Zone erupted into riots in 1964, and 21 people were killed. In 1968, the elected president was deposed when Colonel Omar Torrijos took power as the commander-in-chief of the Defense Forces. A new constitution in 1972 gave Torrijos extraordinary power, which he used to bring about some social reforms. In 1977, U.S. President Jimmy Carter completed negotiations of a new Panama Canal Treaty that would give Panama control of the canal on the last day of 1999. In 1981, Torrijos died in a mysterious plane crash, which was called an accident. But because Ronald Reagan had vociferously opposed the new canal treaty, some suspected the CIA. In 1983, General Manuel Noriega became commander of the Panamanian Defense Forces, PDF. Noriega had been working for the CIA for more than 20 years and claimed that he was paid $10 million for this. He had been trained at the School of the Americas and was head of military intelligence. The next year, Nicolas Ardito Barletta won a narrow victory in an election considered fraudulent. U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz attended his inauguration. In 1985, the former health vice minister, Dr. Hugo Spadafora, was assassinated after visiting Costa Rica. The military was accused, and Ardito Barletta resigned. Noriega appointed the industrialist Eric Arturo del Valle president. In 1986, many newspapers in the United States accused Noriega of drug trafficking. That year, by seizing the ship and exposing the plot, he foiled Oliver North's scheme to pretend to capture communist arms on a ship in the canal bound for the Sandinistas. Colonel Roberto Diaz Herrera had been second in command of the PDF, but was dismissed. At a press conference in June 1987, he accused Noriega of working with the CIA to murder Torrijos, claiming Reagan and Bush knew of this. He accused Noriega of ordering the assassination of Spadafora because he was trying to expose corruption in the Panama government. Diaz Herrera also claimed that Noriega had made millions in bribes by allowing drugs to pass through Panama and for providing false end-user certificates for shipped U.S. arms. Panama's government announced that it was stopping all payments on its debts, and rumors it was printing money led to bank withdrawals. The U.S. Senate suggested that Noriega resign and called for elections. A rally was held on June 30th protesting U.S. interference in Panamanian affairs. 100 demonstrators marched to the U.S. Embassy and did much damage to the building. The United States suspended its aid to Panama and demanded reparations. The Panama government apologized and paid the $106,000, but the U.S. aid was not resumed. On January 8, 1988, Jose Blandon, Panama's consul general in New York City, resigned and blamed Noriega for turning the Panamanian government into a criminal empire by selling passports, visas, airport landing rights, and allowing drug smugglers to use Panama's airports and banking system for payment of more than $300 million. In Miami and Tampa, Florida, U.S. indictments against General Noriega were unsealed on February 4th, charging him with smuggling huge amounts of marijuana into the United States in 1983 and 1984, and of selling ether and acetone for processing cocaine. In February, President del Valle met with the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Elliott Abrams in Miami. Returning to Panama, he told Noriega to step down, but the general refused. Del Valle played a tape for the Panamanian people on February 25th saying he was separating Noriega for his trial. But that night, Del Valle was removed by the Panamanian Assembly, and he went into hiding, still recognized as president by the U.S. In May 1988, the Reagan administration was in the middle of complicated negotiations with Panama. At that time, George Bush was facing a challenge by Democrat Michael Dukakis, and with political advice from James Baker, he slighted the current Reagan approach by announcing that he would never bargain with drug dealers. In May 1989, Guillermo Endara was apparently elected president of Panama with about 3/4 of the votes, but Noriega declared the election fraudulent and nullified. The OAS and the Panamanian Assembly also declined to recognize Endara because the United States had contributed $10 million to his campaign. On October 4th, some officers asked Noriega to resign, but he refused again. Early in the morning on December 20th, 1989, President George Bush sent a force of 26,000 from the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force to attack Panama. The reasons given that American lives and the canal needed to be protected have been dismissed because no evidence has been shown that they were in any danger. The main reason was to remove Noriega so that he could be tried in the United States. Under international law, this is hardly a valid reason for attacking an entire country. The United States claimed that they killed only 324 or 516 Panamanians, but others estimated the number of civilians killed at between 1,000 and 5,000. The Panamanian Defense Forces were targeted, and their capability was destroyed. Although they had also served as police, the U.S. troops did not take over law enforcement, resulting in looting and chaos. Endara and his 2 vice presidents were sworn in at the U.S. Southern Command and moments later formally requested U.S. help in removing Noriega. Many of Endara's political opponents and union leaders were arrested. The United States was in flagrant violation of Article 19 of the OAS Charter, which reads, "No state may use or encourage the use of coercive measures of an economic or political character in order to force the sovereign will of another state and obtain from it advantages of any kind." The U.S. invasion of Panama was condemned both by the United Nations General Assembly and by the Organization of American States. 2 weeks after the invasion, Noriega surrendered. He was later convicted of the drug crimes and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The patriotic propaganda of the U.S. news media offered a stark contrast to the Oscar-winning documentary film The Panama Deception, directed by Barbara Trent. After demonizing Noriega, the U.S. media focused on the Operation Just Cause as a heroic victory, dwelling only on the few U.S. deaths while ignoring how many Panamanians were killed. The film shows a greater context for the invasion and portrays the suffering of the Panamanian people as certain poor neighborhoods were devastated. The film also brought out the many political ramifications as the U.S. punished Panama first economically and then militarily to make sure that it would control the canal that was scheduled for a partial shift in control in January 1990 and complete control by Panama in 2000. By destroying the PDF and making sure there was a compliant regime, the U.S. made sure that its business interests would prevail. School of the America protests. I have no doubt at all that one day the School of the Americas, which has caused so much suffering and death to our sisters and brothers abroad and has been a theft from the poor here at home, will close. We will speak from prison, Your Honor. We will speak from our cells. The truth cannot be silenced. It can't be chained. Roy Bourgeois. Roy Bourgeois had been a Navy officer in Vietnam where he was wounded. But after spending time with Vietnamese orphans, he went to the seminary of the Maryknoll Missionary Order and was ordained a Catholic priest in 1972. He worked as a missionary in Bolivia for 5 years, and he reported to Washington that the government of Bolivia was torturing people. He became especially concerned about El Salvador because 2 of the nuns murdered in December 1980 were his friends. He went to El Salvador and after returning began to speak out. He learned that the United States was training 525 Salvadoran officers at its School of the Americas, SOA, which had been transferred from Panama to Fort Benning, Georgia. In August 1983, dressed as military officers, Bourgeois and 2 others entered the base and from a pine tree played a tape of Archbishop Romero's sermon so that the Salvadorans could hear it. The 3 were arrested and sentenced to 18 months in prison. After 6 Jesuit priests and 2 women were murdered in 1989 at San Salvador, Bourgeois learned that they had been killed by men who had been trained at the School of the Americas, which he began calling the School of the Assassins. Roy and 9 others fasted on water at the gate of Fort Benning for 35 days. On the first anniversary of the Jesuit murders, Bourgeois and the 2 Litke brothers went on the base to pour blood and leave photos of the victims. Research showed that officers were being trained at SOA before and after they committed atrocities in El Salvador. In the spring of 1994, Bourgeois and others fasted for 40 days on the steps of the Capitol in Washington to persuade Congress to defund the School of the Americas. 2 years later, a White House Intelligence Oversight Board admitted that for 10 years training manuals had instructed officers to use murder, torture, and false imprisonment. They were also taught to kidnap, blackmail, and spy on nonviolent opponents. That spring, 12 protesters were arrested for trespassing and were sentenced from 2 to 6 months. Bringing signatures of 1 million people to close the school, 601 protesters were arrested for entering the base on November 16, 1997. Only 31 repeat offenders were indicted, but 22, including Bourgeois, spent 6 months in prison. A documentary by Roy Bourgeois was televised by Public Broadcasting, PBS, in 1998. The next year, the U.S. House of Representatives voted 230 to 197 to delete the funds of SOA, but the House-Senate Conference Committee restored the funding. In January 2001, the School of the Americas was closed for 1 month and then reopened under the name Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, WISC. Nearly 100 people were arrested for protesting the school that year, and 26 were sentenced to 6 months in prison. Annual demonstrations in November 2002 and 2003 drew about 10,000 protesters to Fort Benning each time. 95 people were arrested in 2002 and 44 in 2003. In 2004, an estimated 16,000 attended the demonstration. At least 20 people were arrested, plus 11 people were arrested for the same cause at the Federal Building in Sacramento, California. As of 2005, total time served in prison by 171 demonstrators protesting SOA is 85 years.